Again, more handrails so that people can lean on these areas and view the scenes without actually being on the layout itself. The wall in this area is 45 degrees to the wall adjacent to it over here, and as you can see, there's no joint in the backdrop scenery. And the way I've accomplished this is to wrap that corner using a piece of illustration board that's 30 inches by 40 inches. It's laid horizontally, and the ends are glued to the drywall, and then I've used drywall mud to feather the edges into the existing wall. The same thing occurs in this other corner here at the end of Charmer, where the future sawmill is going. You can see that from the ceiling on the back corner that the background wall is a nice smooth transition from one wall to another. When I planned the lighting, I designed it so that we had fluorescent lights in rows that would follow the layout itself, and the lighting itself gives overall general lighting to the layout without any sort of real hot spots. Now, by not having these hot spots, you don't get any shadows, which takes away from the depth of field and the dimension of the models, so that you don't get any natural element that you would from the sunlight. It gives the models a fairly two-dimensional look to them. Here's an example of what I mean. You can see the water tank. It looks pretty good in the scene itself. It's fairly well lit. It's fairly uniform, quite acceptable in most circumstances. Nothing wrong with it whatsoever. Now, this is what it looks like with quartz halogen lamps pointed at the scene. What it does, it adds additional light to the area and highlights the scene so that your attention is brought to the scene, but at the same time, it adds a real dimension to the model in the way the sun would cast shadows on the layout. Again, this is without it, and then this is with it, and you can see it makes quite a difference in the in the effect that you get. Again, you see this with the cooling tower. The quartz halogens, which are 50 watts each, 12 volt, and they feed light to the scene, highlighting the cooling tower, strong shadows, highlighted areas, just as if it was being done by the sun. And of course, the overall scene is also illuminated with a little additional light that brings your attention to that particular area. And then the lights disappear between scenes, leaving the fluorescent light, which is just a lower level of intensity than you would get in these particular scenes. And that draws you from scene to scene to scene instead of the monotonous, continuous level of light that you would normally get. Since I had planned the layout with essentially a permanent and final track plan, I never anticipated to have to change and do any modifications to the layout. So the panels themselves have all been printed on printer's plate, and then those were mounted on a 1/4-inch plexiglass, and automotive clear coat was sprayed over that to seal the printing plates. The toggle switches control blocks, which were a result of my original system that was PFM, Sound System 2, and I used the SDS remotes as cordless controls. That allowed all the sound system components to be placed under the layout where they were out of reach from hands and also out of sight to keep the layout a lot simpler looking. The toggle switches are rotary switches. They control slow motion stall motors, and adjacent to those are LEDs that indicate green being the primary route and red being the turnout route, and they give you a good visual from a distance in which way the switches are thrown. Now my layout is converted to DCC. I use NC throttles that are all wireless, and Tsunami sound units in all the locomotives. The panels also have instructions on them to assist newcomers who use the layout as to what switches do what, and the grades, the elevations, and of course which is east and west on the layout. This gives you an idea with the LEDs illuminated along with the toggle switches, just exactly how they work. You can see where the various track lights that carry the MR16 spots are strategically located along key areas of the layout where I want the lamps to point to various scenes to highlight them. Good example, as you can see, is the station. Again, you can see the shadows from the eaves, and over on this side here, the future snow shed is a scene, and the tunnel. That whole area is illuminated with a little bit more intensity than in an area that's just slightly to the side of it. So the yard itself, which essentially is a flat area with very little change in elevation except along Terrace Avenue in the front of the layout, is all 3/4 inch plywood sheathing. And I've used plywood sheathing because it's exterior material and will not absorb any water when a lot of water is put into the scenery material itself. And a little bit of a rough face allows the sand and the ballast and any scenery material just to have a little bit more bite, a little more bond to it again. Once you leave the flat area of the yards, the entire layout from there onwards is all done with spline. And you can see a sample of the spline here. Now, this is solid spline without putting any spaces in between. It just gave me a better surface to lay the cork roadbed and the ties on, and it gives a very rigid serpentine flow to the track by using this method. It also allows for scenery to vary between the track, and you can also see the cardboard strips that lace in between the spline itself to create the scenery. And then of course in areas where there's going to be trestles and so on, I use risers. Again, it's 1x4 clear pine risers that are fastened to the joists, and then the spline is adjusted with the elevation as it rises or falls. I pour children's play sand over all the flat areas and any plaster areas as a base before I put any finished material on it. That way, if there's any damage or movement at all, you're going to see a natural material. It also adds a little bit of texture in some cases, and the sand allows you sort of brush and play with very subtle changes in the elevations of the surface with swales and so on. You can see these subtle areas where the front of the layout is approximately a ½ inch above the track itself, so that the scenery is built up on the front edge with a bit of plaster, the sand over that, and then it just flows in towards the track itself.